Hello and welcome to the Curated Conversations webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Arts in Cultural Heritage Management and Museum Studies program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion with Saber Moore and Liz Melicker on museums as incubators for civic discourse. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note, today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Curated Conversations playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the event to our moderator, Dr. Stephanie Brown, the Assistant Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Arts in Museum Studies program.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everybody. I'm so glad that we're all here together. So tonight we're going to talk about museums and their role in civic discourse. Johns Hopkins President Ron Daniels recently wrote about universities as core institutions of democracy. So what we're going to talk about tonight is whether and how museums can serve in that role. The Carter County Museum in Ekalaka, Montana, and the Presidio in San Francisco, California, may not appear to have much in common. Yet, both institutions center sharing research and expertise around difficult topics. Both museums have created safe spaces for hard conversations. How can museums create and foster opportunities for civic discourse around issues that matter? So, our speakers tonight, we're so fortunate to have with us Liz Melicker, who is an experienced museum professional with expertise in curatorial practice. She's the curator for the Presidio Trust in San Francisco, where she leads the Trust curation program, preserving and sharing the Presidio's collections with current and future generations. Public exhibitions at the Historic Officers Club highlight these collections and invite the public to consider how the park's history is relevant today through participatory, co-created experiences. Melicker holds an MA in anthropology from Stanford University, and prior to joining the Presidio Trust in 2005, worked in cultural resource management in California and Hawaii, her home state. Dr. Saber Moore is the executive director of the Carter County Museum in Ekalaka, Montana. Moore received her PhD in American Studies with a focus in public history from Montana State University in 2023. She received her MA in Museum Studies and Nonprofit Management from Johns Hopkins in 2016. We're very proud of her. And a Bachelor of Arts in History from Montana State University in 2013. Moore's research focuses on museums and rural community vitality and how power is exercised in practices of place. So with that, I'm gonna let Saber get started. The way that we're gonna run this tonight is Saber will speak for about 10 minutes about her work, and then we'll turn it over to Liz to speak for about 10 minutes. The three of us will then have some conversation around issues that have come up, and then we'll open it up and take as many of your questions and comments as we have time for, okay? So, so let's get started. Saber, over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that marvelous introduction. I'll try to live up to it, especially as a newly minted doctor.
That's
it's
right.
Still so weird to hear that.
It's great. Enjoy it.
Okay, everybody, so welcome. I'm focusing on the Carter County Museum and in particular our program on the Yelamu vaccine. Dr. Yelamu was a pioneering vaccinologist who was born in Miles City, Montana, which is about 2 hours from Ekalaka. And we did an exhibit called Shots Felt Around the World, Dr. Maurice Yelamu and the Montana Origins of the Fight Against Pandemics. This program was begun in 2020 as part of a research effort, and with the pandemic, of course, raging all around us. And then we had it in 2021 in Ekalaka, and then it hit the road in 2022 around Montana. Next slide. And Stephanie did a great job of introducing me. If anybody wants to copy down my email real quick, you're welcome to. Just in case we get cut off for questions or if some idea comes to you later on, feel free to contact me anytime. smore@cartercountymuseum.org. Next slide. The Carter County Museum is located in Ekalaka. It's a town on the far southeastern corner of Montana, which is underneath Canada and above Wyoming. We get lots of questions about where it is. Sometimes they say that Ekalaka is known as the town that hunts bones. And that was in the 1930s. We had a number of individuals that were going around the area finding bones on their land and also finding, sorry about that, paleontologists from different museums around the world that were working in the Ekalaka area because this has a great preservation of dinosaurs right before the extinction event happened. Next slide. The Carter County Museum was founded in 1936. It's the first county museum in Montana and the first to display dinosaurs. We offer free admission year-round. We have about 6,000 guests annually pre-COVID, 5,300 in 2022. But we reach an additional 100,000 people through educational programs and traveling exhibitions. This is really amazing because we are a rural museum. There's only about 4 people on staff. I'm the only full-time year-round staff member. And we sit in a town of about 400 people, and our nearest big city, I'm qualifying that by the location of a Walmart, is about 2 hours away, which can be quite a drive. Prior to 2010, the road that came to Ekalaka from Miles City literally ended here. So we say all roads end in Ekalaka. But now we have a road that goes through to the south, which is pretty exciting as of 2011. And so all roads lead to Ekalaka and you can get out now, which is nice. We have ardent public support through property tax in the county, which is part of us being a county museum that helps fund the staff salaries as well as the utilities. But everything that we do in the museum, from exhibits to collections to the field program, is through the Carter County Geological Society, which is our nonprofit arm. Next slide. These are a couple pictures of what we do. So not only do we operate exhibits at the museum, we like to say we have 100 million years of history from the time period when the Ekalaka was underneath a interior seaway, all the way up to when it had beachfront property, which I wish it still had some days, to the modern day when we are in a prairie badlands area, which is pretty cool. So we talk a bit about the dinosaur history, of course, but also natural history of the region, the 14 different tribes that called Ekalaka, the Ekalaka area, part of their common hunting grounds. And then also we run what's called the annual Dino Shindig every year, which has all of our visiting paleontologists sharing their research with the rest of the community in a family-friendly format. So we're one of the few that do that. And that also features a barbecue, a street dance, and just a little bit of everything for everyone. Not only do we do dinosaur stuff, of course, but we lead a junior scientist program throughout the summer. That's that middle picture on the bottom there. We do amber embedding, so people can come in and embed little pieces of amber and discover new insect species. We lead dark sky programs during the summertime, guided stargazing in our pristine night skies, one of the other advantages of rural. And then we also do a lot of different workshops and lecture programs for people too. Next slide. So again, Shots Felt Around the World is the exhibit I decided to spotlight today, especially with the theme of today's presentation. We, again, are located in a rural community, and it's an area that when the pandemic hit, we had a lot of members that were very concerned about what was going on and wondering what kind of information they were receiving, how to kind of get through that information and decide for themselves what's happening. And so we led a survey that kind of got that from our membership, that they wanted the museum to take a leadership role in talking about vaccines and in talking about pandemics in general. So we worked with the local healthcare, Dahl Memorial Hospital, and then also our local teachers to create both the exhibit and a companion program for a K through 12 in the classroom. Next slide. The curriculum was peer-reviewed by virologists from Montana State University, professors, and the Vaccine Makers Group out of Philadelphia Children's Hospital. It was piloted in Carter County High School math classroom here in Ekalaka in 2021, and it had a really strong focus on science literacy as well. So we were examining real-life, real-time information from the COVID pandemic at the same time that this was being taught in the classroom, which was pretty cool. The first several panels focus on the life of Maurice Hilleman, who again grew up in a rural community in Montana and went to school at then Montana State College, now Montana State University. He was from a ranching background, which helped really connect with the audiences here in Eastern Montana. And then the remaining panels, we focus a bit on how to explain the science of vaccines, some of the Montana origins, about the Rocky Mountain Research Hospital here. And that was one that helped develop the Pfizer vaccine, as well as the Moderna vaccine. And then we also talk about more specifically related local stories, like you see in this panel here, which focuses on infectious disease in Carter County. Of course, COVID-19 was not the first pandemic to hit our area, and also not the most devastating one. We had smallpox, the 1918 flu, and then outbreaks of measles, mumps, and rubella throughout the community. And putting that story in the own words of people that were from Ekalaka, people that lived here and that are the ancestors or of a lot of people that live here now, it was a really good way to really bring it home and make it seem like it wasn't people from one coast or another bringing their views on the topic into this community. So really a homegrown approach. And it helps make it very accessible for not just our local audience, but also for other rural audiences. Next slide. This is a poster that depicts the curriculum. So I mentioned that the curriculum was piloted in the math classroom. We had two other teachers working on it as well, one from the elementary and area, and then also another from a science background. And the four of us got together and gave a talk at the Montana Educators Association conference, which was virtual that year, of course. And we talked about how we had piloted this locally in a rural classroom and how that could be spread throughout the rest of the state. It was picked up by about 10 other classrooms in that first year. So it was K through 12, but we also worked with the Indian Education for All program outside from the Montana Office of Public Instruction, and included 2 lessons that focused on the Ekalaka Crow and then the Blackfeet Nation as well in the discussion. So that was a really cool way to integrate more perspectives. Next slide. From May 28th to November 14th, it was on display in the Carter County Museum, actually in our schoolhouse, which is a one-room schoolhouse that we moved to the museum as part of one of our outdoor exhibits. It's the only space that would fit this. A lot of our small rural museums understand space is at a premium, so we were lucky to be able to put this in our schoolhouse. We digitized the exhibit as well and had it available online and reached an additional 44,000 people. Next slide. After it was at the museum, when the schoolhouse was too cold to go into because it's not insulated, we moved it to the local hospital, where it remains on display actually in the top mezzanine and in the visitor area. Between November 19th, which just happened to be National Rural Health Day, and October 31st, we had about 2,201 visitors. The really cool thing about the hospital is that it was recently built, and that was when it first opened to the public in 2021. It's a $10 million hospital. That's just, we're very fortunate to have that here in our community. Next slide. In 2022, Shots Felt Round Montana, the exhibit went on the road thanks to a generous grant from Humanities Montana through the CARES program. It went to a number of One Health clinics, which is a community clinic infrastructure here in Montana, as well as museums and libraries. And in some communities, it went to both, which was pretty cool. Next slide. During the course of it traveling around, we made sure that we had each museum have 2 of their own banners that again had the stories of pandemics and infectious disease and healthcare in their own community words. I worked with either a librarian or a museum professional in each community to create these banners, again, to make sure that it was locally grown and heard. This is an example of Blaine County Museum in Chinook. Next slide. Which had a total of 127 visitors and then 57 students that did the curriculum. Next slide. One Health in about 7 different communities hosted some of theirs as well. For One Health, we created a About One Health banner, and then they've, in 3 different communities, had the exhibit as part of the opening of their new health clinics, which happened during 2022 as well. Next slide. From April 4th to the 27th, it was at the One Health community in the Custer County Convention Center. 127 students also participated in the curriculum through the public health program that was run through the schools, which is pretty cool. Next slide. The Western Heritage Center in Billings created their own Conquering Diseases of the Past, and the Hilleman exhibit kind of fell in there to talk about the background of Hilleman in reference to the diseases that had been prevalent in Billings at the time. Next slide. While it was there, 1,938 visitors visited. This is a very interesting statistic because the museum in Billings is in the largest city in Montana. It has over 100,000 people there, but we had about 1,900 people visit throughout the summer. So it's fun to see numbers that are similar in rural communities to these larger ones. Next slide. Lewistown Public Library was the first library that hosted the Hilleman exhibit. Again, we had local panels created. Next slide. 8,340 visitors saw it, also at the One Health Clinic in Lewistown. So it was part of the opening there. It was put right in front on Main Street. Those 8,000 visitors actually did walk through the doors, though, in the clinic's first several months of being opened, which is really quite amazing. Next slide. Dawson County, the Frontier Gateway Museum hosted it as well. Next slide. The Great Falls Museum, Public Library, 11,646 visitors there. Next slide. Bighorn County Historical Museum in Hardin, which is near the Crow Reservation, hosted the exhibit and actually featured both in the infectious disease discussion and the healthcare and Bighorn County discussion, stories from Crow tribal members, which is really cool to have that part of there. And then we hosted a film that goes through the life of Dr. Hilleman and had panelists from Indian healthcare as well. Next slide. A total of 1,347 visitors saw it there. Next slide. Overall attendance for Schattsville, Rye, Montana, 23,536 visitors. We had a total of 184 students go through the curriculum in those communities, and then 72 people attended the film discussions, which featured the film, a bit of the exhibit, and also a local panelist or 2 from a local healthcare facility that, again, just answered audience questions about the pandemic and medicine in general and introducing people to their local healthcare workers. Next slide. We conducted a survey that was part of it. There was 77% of people that answered the survey were female. The majority ages were 26 to 35, Caucasian, and then American Indian and Black. Next. We asked about people if they knew about Maurice Hilleman before attending the exhibit. He created 8 of the 13 vaccines that you receive as a kid, so it was kind of important to see that. Most people said no. Next slide. And then to select your level of understanding before and after attending the exhibit. So you can see in all areas, we had at least a moderate amount of change in learning about infectious diseases, vaccine, Montana history, local healthcare, and local history of infectious disease. Next slide. I also always ask about how exhibitions impact you. This is in part from John Folk's research about audiences and the social impact of museums. The majority said that it improved their knowledge or understanding and satisfied a personal, academic, or professional interest in the subject. Next slide. And that's all I got. We'll save questions for later, but I'm going to turn it over to Liz.
Thanks, Saber. That was great. That was great. It's fun to see those banners. Liz, are you ready to go?
I am ready to go.
All right. All right. Let's see what's going on in the Presidio.
All righty. Peter, when you are ready with the slides. And good afternoon, everyone. Well, we're getting slides up. I just wanted to say thank you so much to Johns Hopkins University and Stephanie in particular for inviting me to participate in this conversation today. Thanks to Peter, who is orchestrating and techno-wizarding and producing things behind the scenes. It's an honor and a privilege to join you, Saber, in talking about our curatorial work and challenging conversations in museum spaces. All right, that's it. Okay.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's see. So as Stephanie noted in her introductions, I am the curator of the Presidio Trust, which is in San Francisco. And as I get started, I just want to acknowledge the fact that the present day Presidio, which you can see here in the foreground of this picture, occupies the traditional territory of the Yelamu, which were a local tribe of Ramaytush Ohlone. And I'm speaking to you from a little bit north of the Golden Gate, from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Southern Pomo and Coast Miwok peoples. So today, the Presidio is a 1,500-acre urban national park site. You can see it here. I didn't technically include a map, but this gives you a sense very clearly of how the park abuts the dense urban grid of San Francisco itself. So it's located in the very northwestern corner of San Francisco at the southern terminus of the Golden Gate Bridge, where the Pacific Ocean meets the San Francisco Bay. The Golden Gate Bridge is just behind us in the perspective of this shot, but I promise it makes a brief appearance later. The Presidio and San Francisco, of course, sit at the heart of the San Francisco Bay Area, which is a metropolitan area of nearly 8 million people. So a little bit different than Saber's context. The Presidio is part of a chain of parklands that actually stretch through 3 different counties in the Bay Area, and they cover 80,000 acres in total, including notable landmarks as different and well-known as Muir Woods, home to giant redwoods, and Alcatraz Island, the former federal penitentiary. My colleagues and I often remark that the history of the Presidio is inherently difficult. It's a unique, complex, and complicated place. It served as a backdrop for pivotal moments in the nation's history, both triumphant and tragic. It was a site of colonization, first by Imperial Spain, and then again by the United States, a key location that supported wars domestically and internationally, and imperialism, and a seat that wielded nation-state power that's still owned and operated by the federal government of the United States today. Next slide, please. Before there was a Presidio, there was a village called Petaluma, which was home to the Ramaytush Ohlone people. By some estimates, more than 30,000 people lived in the greater Bay Area at the time of Western contact, making it one of the most densely populated areas of Native North America. So it was and is a very dense urban area, if you will. Into this landscape of Native North America, El Presidio Real de San Francisco was built as part of Spain's colonial project in 1776 at this very valuable port of San Francisco at the far northern edge of the Spanish Empire, about 100 miles south of the southern edge of the Russian Empire. The Presidio would eventually serve as a military post and hence site of colonization and imperialization under 3 flags: Spain, Mexico, and the United States. And when it closed in the early 1990s, it was the longest continually operating military site in the United States. Next slide, please. Today, the park is a National Historic Landmark District, which is the highest both designation and for significance and level of protection afforded historic sites by the federal government. It's managed by two federal agencies, the National Park Service and the Presidio Trust, which I work for. The trust is an innovative federal agency specifically created to save the Presidio and preserve it after the Army left and transform it for a new national purpose. And that's twofold: to, on the one hand, steward its cultural, natural, scenic, and recreational resources, and then also share it for all people to enjoy forever. And so one of the ways in which we both steward and share the Presidio is through our curatorial program, which is jointly charged with preserving and sharing the Presidio's collections with the public. Next slide, please. I'll talk a little bit about our curatorial philosophy and then writ large, and then dive into one of our current exhibitions more specifically. In developing exhibitions, our philosophy is really based in community engagement and shared authority, and underpinned in that by several key approaches. All the work we do is place-based interpretation, meaning that the exhibitions are rooted in the park's history, and we're hoping to instill in visitors the curiosity and the historical imagination to go out and explore sites in the landscape. We employ storytelling and microhistory, employing emotional connection at a very intimate scale to help visitors connect with a past that at times feels close and at times feels more distant. I like the way historian Charles Joyner described microhistory is this idea of asking large questions in small places. Another tenet of our work is that history is continually being written, right? That there's ongoing discovery of the past and of place, whether that's formal research by one of our resource managers, community-based knowledge, or simply the idea that our perspectives, technologies, and understandings are constantly evolving. And as part of that, also, we very firmly believe that there are many ways of knowing. So what that means for us is intentionally working to juxtapose different ways of understanding the past, to attempt to not privilege one way of knowing over another, but hopefully see them as compatible and complementary ways of understanding the world. So special exhibitions add an additional layer of depth to that. And also specifically, one of our goals with them is to inspire civic engagement by fostering an understanding of the ways in which the park's past is relevant today. Next slide, please. So I'll talk briefly about how our current special exhibition Exclusion operationalizes all of this in practice. During World War II, the Presidio of San Francisco was the headquarters for the United States Army's Western Defense Command, and it played a pivotal role in the unjust incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans. From an office in a building at the Presidio, the leader of the Western Defense Command, the Lieutenant General DeWitt, signed 108 civilian exclusion orders implementing Executive Order 9066, targeting Japanese Americans, both citizens and non-citizens, and forcibly removing them for the duration of the war. 2/3 of the people imprisoned were American citizens. The others were first-generation immigrants and were barred from citizenship by federal law. So in effect, imprisoning American citizens without due process. The exhibition invites visitors to investigate the choices, both personal and political, that led to this chapter in American history. How did leaders arrive at this decision? How did Japanese Americans respond? How did other community members respond? And then we also specifically put forward this invitation to think about what as a nation have we learned that can help us address present day issues of immigration, of racial profiling, and mass incarceration. Next slide, please. In developing an exhibition based on these historic events, we worked with community collaborators that offered deep personal significance and cultural expertise on both the historic events and their contemporary relevance, not just to the Japanese American community, but very broadly, both to other minority communities and to the population writ large. And in working with our collaborators, one thing we heard repeatedly was that as a federal agency operating the national park site where the civilian exclusion orders were issued, we were uniquely positioned to explore the story of the government's own actions in the 1940s. So the central focus of the exhibition, both conceptually but also physically, what you see here on the left of the screen, is the Presidio, and then by extension, the rest of the federal government's role in the incarceration. We grounded our interpretation in the federal government's own investigation that was conducted by a congressional commission in the early 1980s. The federal government unequivocally stated at that point that, quote, race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership, end quote, had motivated the incarceration. The eagle-eyed, or perhaps all of you, will notice there's a panel, an upright panel, just to the right of the desk that has the title failure of leadership. So we were bold, but drew on the assertions the federal government has already made about itself. Next slide, please. Another thing that stemmed from our community collaborations and also from our research were the significance of language, the choices we made about language that was used to describe these events. Language matters. It matters profoundly, powerfully. It can conceal and diminish, as it did historically, or it can be direct, transparent, and be a space for truth-telling. In the gallery, this informed both the language we used in the text itself and the content. It informed the design aesthetic. You can see here these kind of large hyperscale words at the upper story of the exhibition, drawn from the civilian exclusion orders. And it also informed the participatory elements we called Your Voice Matters. And that's what you see here in the red panel in the kind of front of the center of the image. In Your Voice Matters, visitors are reminded of the power of individual voices, of their individual voices in the democracy of the United States. And they're encouraged to engage in dialogue about these parallel contemporary social issues that mirror the issues that were at play in the 1940s. Each station includes prompts that examine what we call nonpartisan issues of civic engagement in lowercase d democratic society. So things like civil liberties, things like journalism, things like community engagement. And you can't really see it in the slide, but in that upright, the little white things are cards that visitors contribute. And behind them are words and phrases embedded in the station that reflect language that was being used in mainstream news reports at the time we were developing the exhibition. So just a little bit about that. The issues presented in the exhibition continue to be evergreen. We first began development in the summer of 2015, and we opened in 2017. So a lot changed in the world in that period of time. And of course, a lot has continued to change in our world in ways we maybe couldn't even have imagined, those of us that are not like epidemiologists. But social movements have mobilized around the issues presented in the exhibition, not the specific ones, but the general themes. Our national leadership has changed and changed again, and will change again soon. Executive orders, the Supreme Court, civil rights are regularly in the news cycle. And visitor response to Your Voice Matters really reflects that continued relevance. They're the most popular part of the exhibition, I think, not only for the opportunity that visitors have to share and contribute their own thoughts, but also read each other's contributions. And every once in a while, like write on each other's contributions, usually civilly. And the content that visitors are creating and sharing includes everything from family history to reflections on the current state of the world to inspired calls for action, and represents a very broad diversity of perspectives. And I'll leave it there so we can turn to conversation, but just, want to note that I think being willing to have hard conversations, to make space for civil discourse, and to not shy away from difficult topics is such an important thing that we can do as museums, as government entities in just creating a space for trust building and accountability and learning.
Thank you, Liz. I have to get up to the Presidio to see this exhibit. So two very different kinds of exhibitions, but I feel like there's an enormous through line, right? and both of your institutions are starting where you are, right? And starting where your audiences are, and then figuring out how to have complicated conversations. So, before we'll open things up for questions and comments, and please go ahead, folks. If folks who are watching, who are with us, drop your comments or questions in either the chat or the Q&A. Both we'll see them no matter what. But before we get to that, this is the first time, Saber and Liz, that you all have seen each other's work. And I just wonder what resonates, and I know we're talking, let's just say it out loud. We are talking about vastly different budgets. We are talking about vastly different scopes of collection, in chronological terms, and in the amount of stuff that we're looking at. So if we, take all of that kind of context as read, what are the things that when you heard each other talk about, you thought, oh yeah, we talked about that? Saber, why don't you start, since you're just coming off of hearing from Liz?
I do have the advantage there. I just want to start off with, I am so impressed. I want to visit, and it's not that easy for me to get over to San Francisco, but it's just an amazing looking exhibit. I love the interactivity of it. The fact that you can write notes and read notes and talk to others in that space. That's something that we lacked in our exhibit, as it was in a small schoolhouse, so maybe one or two people could see it at a time. I also love that you acknowledged the local political climate. That takes guts, and it's something really amazing to see in that urban community too. So yeah, those are my first impressions.
Yeah.
Just amazing, just impressed.
And Saber, thinking about the opportunities for interaction, the fact that the Hillman exhibit was also a school curriculum, I think, is an opportunity for interaction that in an urban situation, there are a lot more layers of bureaucracy and administration between Liz and getting a curriculum into the public schools, and getting a curriculum into the public schools. So how did you feel like, did your data show, and did you feel like that having that curriculum had a real impact?
Yes, I think the curriculum was really, especially in our local community here in Ekalaka, it was an amazing form of engagement, an amazing way to have really deep conversations about the material. You might visit the museum for an hour and go through the exhibit, but these classes spend an entire semester on this content, which was just amazing. And the students too felt like they were a real part of shaping that curriculum as well, being the pilot subjects for it, and could really have frank, deep conversations with their teachers, and then take those home with their parents and bring them to the exhibit too. We're very fortunate there. And you're right. That's one of the advantages of being rural and being in a small institution. We were able to get it off the ground and running in a matter of months, and going through the school, and so where it could be really timely, and again happening in real time with the pandemic instead of a couple years later.
Right.
I was just going to say, I think that point, right, that there are so many ways of engaging communities we serve or hope to serve, in really, right, kind of like fundamentally what I think about is like sharing authority in some ways. Not that there's obviously I think my favorite, I'll say it this way, I think my favorite thing I ever read about this was the idea of like, responsible authority sharing, the idea that we have a professional responsibility to be factual, in our case as a federal entity, right, to be nonpartisan, but that there's so much we can do, and so many different ways of sharing that authority. And I was really struck by this idea of how are we hearing from in both exhibits? And I'm just really impressed by that idea of hearing from the community, of engaging them, not only with the exhibition, the way it was presented in Carter County, but then the school curriculum, the fact that as it traveled throughout the state, each community had that opportunity, right, of seeing, local folks' words and experiences in print as part of the exhibition. I think that's such a powerful democratizing thing that we can do and should do that really enriches the work, right, and helps make it relevant and meaningful. And I think, Saber, you said something along these lines too, but it's a way for people to connect with a story that they see themselves as part of that. And I just think that's a very profound thing, not only for these topics, not necessarily only for difficult history, but really for any kind of content that's presented in a museum, for people to be able to make that personal connection and not see it as other.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to our sort of overarching question of museums and museums as places that can be central to a democracy, lowercase d. And can you both talk about, from your vastly different perspectives, how does that feel on the ground? In this, as you do your museum practice, right? How does it feel to be someone whose job is to preserve and serve and share, and sometimes challenge, and sometimes make uncomfortable, but always try to create space? How does that feel on the ground in Ekalaka and in San Francisco?
Liz, you want to start?
I think, sure. I think it's funny, one of the places I go to kind of how that feels is the experience of being in the gallery with visitors. And, in our case, a lot of the people doing that face-to-face engagement are volunteer docents. And, we haven't shied away. A number of our special exhibitions have had topics that are in some way potentially challenging to visitors, whether it's, a topic that's just inherently challenging, whether it's asking them to kind of open up and consider new perspectives. And so I've thought a lot about that in terms of, how do we equip our volunteers to be in a space where, we don't expect them to be experts. We want to give them tools, as much tools that are about content as they are about kind of facilitating a visitor experience, kind of, customer service, but customer service in an interpretive and historic context. And, I think for me, I feel a sense of responsibility, I would say, to really everyone that is then a part of that lived experience of being in the exhibition, whether it's visitors, volunteer docents, our visitor services staff, just making sure that they, they feel like they have tools and support and space to be in these sometimes challenging interpersonal interactions. And a lot of that is around, really helping people learn how to hold space, to hold space from ideas that are different than theirs, to hold maybe space for their ideas that might be different when they're on their own time than their ideas when they're volunteering for a government organization. And then one of the other things too, I think, is also it's grounded in respect, right? And in respecting others and respecting differences of opinion. And that's obviously really, critical to creating successful experiences all around, I think, regardless of who you are in the experience of that exhibit. Yeah. Saber, what about you? I'm curious to hear your take on that.
Yes, so in Ekalaka, one of the fun and challenging things about being in a small town is you're easily held accountable and easily findable. So we, when we have exhibits like this, and just exhibits in general, people have no shyness in approaching us for a conversation about something, whether it's myself as the director or the curator, the receptionist. And it's really important to give staff the talking points like you're talking about.
Huh.
And in looking at how we did what we did, why we did it, why we chose local stories, that's in direct relationship to knowing that the community feels a really great ownership over history, but also the importance of the community to hear from a local perspective that also presents these global issues.
Okay. Mhm.
And to be seen to be visibly responding in as quickly as we can in real time to these discussions and to what we're learning, not just from the students in the schools, but also having our local healthcare people being able to come in saying, hey, I noticed this, or I got this question today. Can you address that as well? Something. And so it was just, that's a way that we've been really plugged into our community, not just in the past few years, but we were founded originally in the basement of the old high school before we moved into our own building. And a lot of those students are now parents and grandparents of kids in the community now and remember that relationship with the museum and continue it. So just honoring that really heavy responsibility, but also having fun with it too. It's a unique position to be in, and we really do enjoy it and take it seriously.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. You know, we have about 10 minutes left. How about that? So I want to try to get to some of the questions. Peter, you want to pitch
Sure,
us,
happy
pitch us a
to.
couple questions?
And again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We had a question from Zoe, who was asking for Saber and for Liz, how do you manage uncivil discourses in these spaces? They're especially curious about how you or the museums and the represent balance presenting information, research, and lived experiences with visitors or visitor responses that have a different worldview, opinion, or perhaps misinformation.
That's a great question, Zoe. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to tackle that unless you want to take the first bite at that one, Saber.
Go ahead.
Okay. It's such a good question, right? Because it does happen. Absolutely. And you know, one of the things this is interesting. It just kind of, again, makes me think of like similarities and differences between the institutions. One of the great benefits of working for a several hundred person federal organization is that we actually have in-house legal counsel. And so they've tackled this question before in things like our website, right? About what are the rules of engagement for the website. And so we actually adapted that kind of virtual policy around how people are engaging, and implemented that in terms of how we monitor the participatory co-created aspects of exclusion. You know, that said, it's a pretty light touch. I mean, we draw the line at things like, right, defamation, libel, right, violence. And knock on wood, we've been lucky. No one has defaced the exhibition in a permanent way. They've kept at least to these cards, which we can remove, right? And we have done that, not a lot. And really only when it's crossing the line into something that is defamatory or inciting something difficult. You know, a couple of times I have had to call and say, hey, do you need to know about this comment that we got? And then, you know, the other thing that that we've done is really, you know, I think kind of goes back to who's on the ground in the space interacting with visitors, and, you know, and helping support them in difficult conversations. So it's actually something we modeled and practiced as part of our education for docents around this exhibition. And I think that's such a profound thing to do. There's actually a really lovely piece of research that was done by a master's student at John F. Kennedy here in the Bay Area about that topic, basically about how you support volunteers and frontline staff in what can be uncivil discourse. And I'll drop that in the chat in a second. But yeah, I think those kind of two things are how we've approached that topic. Saber, how have you dealt with it?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Sorry, go ahead.
Saber, I'm gonna, we have two more really great questions. So I definitely want to hear what you have to say about it, but I just with that caveat.
Okay, cool. I'll be quick.
Okay.
I think we really had an advantage coming from a story of common ground, coming from a story of Eastern Montana and focusing again on local place and history. We did not have many, knock on wood, difficult conversations here in Ekalaka. However, when the exhibit went on the road, there were some conversations happening in other communities about, like, first off, where did this come from? Oh, another rural community? Okay, well, maybe I'll take a listen. I made ourselves available as a resource for anyone having those conversations in their communities to directly engage with me about the exhibits. And then we also had a really, really close relationship with the local healthcare areas in each community, and to have them available to help answer some of the more challenging questions, because I'm not a vaccinologist, I'm not a healthcare worker. And it's really important to be able to answer those from a place of expertise, and to acknowledge when you don't have that expertise. So I think people really appreciated that we didn't preach from an area of not knowing.
Great. We had we had a similar, or sort of a in conjunction with question from Catherine, saying that I think the local aspects, the signage that accompanied the exhibition were brilliant concept. How did you address any pushback about vaccines or the exhibit? And it was sort of tying on to what you're just saying.
Yeah, so we were really focused on, again, just providing information and ways to get different types of information. On the virtual version of the exhibits, we have links not just to the CDC, but to a lot of different areas where you can get and really vet info. That's a lot of what we taught the kids in the classroom, is just how to develop that health literacy and that science literacy that maybe you don't have naturally. Of course, none of us do, and really engaging with that too. So I think, again, pointing to the experts, a variety of experts, and then also allowing people to have that conversation about grace, and knowing that this is happening so quickly and in real time, that facts can change, facts can grow, and have a background that really gives them new scope and depth, and just giving people the idea that we're all learning this together, we're all in this together, that common ground, and just having those conversations really help diffuse some of those initial, like, there were some strikes in some areas that healthcare workers had dealt with, and being able to come to the museum and have those discussions and in a safe space with their fellow citizens. It was a really cool thing to create.
That's great.
Yeah.
We had sort of another question from Lorna. She was curious about the different indigenous perspectives on vaccines in Western medicine, and how those panels went when they participated in Montana.
Yes, so that one specifically came up in Hardin, that community that's right next to the Crow Reservation. And some of it was really interesting because there's a lot of Crow people that work at the Bighorn County Museum. They're able to engage with others that were coming and viewing the exhibit. And to have a Crow curator actually participate in creating the local panels was huge, and giving that voice and those different voices a center stage in the project as well. That was the first thing that they saw as they came into that exhibit, as opposed to the story about Dr. Hillman from a Western community, which was cool. The other interesting part about that, we had really, really good discussion in the film showing about Hillman's life, and the local healthcare panelists that were talking in the community with, like, hey, there's a long history with Indigenous peoples and vaccines and exploitation, and just watching the healthcare professionals engage with that and meet from an area of like acknowledgement and conversation too. So it was cool to watch as an observer. And I think, again, having that in the local community was massive.
Wonderful.
And Liz, how did that, very, very different scale, but the Japanese American internment was something that when I moved to the Bay Area, I realized that it echoes here in a very different way than it echoes in other parts of the country, because it happened right here. It happened a few miles away. So how did that immediacy play out? Did you see it playing out with visitors? Do you see it playing out with visitors and with your volunteers?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The majority of our visitation comes from the Bay Area or California writ large. So it's folks that, if they're not necessarily familiar with it, it's still a history that's, happening right in your state. And so I think it's a national story, but it is local. And, I think that played out in a few ways. A lot of folks just learning things that they hadn't necessarily learned. A lot of that was around language, right? The idea that our use of language has evolved as we've talked about these historic events, including some really difficult, challenges, that are really really meaningful and really matter. So the idea, why did we use the word incarceration? Because that's actually legally what happened. Things like that. Another place that it played out is we've gotten really high visitation from the Japanese American community, and that is a really incredible thing, because I think one of the things we were very fortunate, we worked with a couple of community-based organizations, and then we're able to just capitalize on kind of existing networks and existing awareness within the Japanese American community about both this history and then also how it reverberates into the present day. There's a lot of movement within the community around these issues that aren't necessarily specifically related to Japanese Americans, but are echoing some of the experiences that their community faced in the 1940s. And that was an interesting learning point. I think for a lot of our internal stakeholders was just, this is an exhibition that touches on issues that really are not unique to a specific group, but are affecting a lot of folks. Sorry, that it's tangential from what you asked.
No. In fact, I think that leads us to a great wrapping up spot. We have 1 minute left, so I want to end by echoing something that Saber just said about engaging with grace, and about how I think that as we all learn how to do this difficult and very important work, that engaging with grace is really something that needs to be at the forefront all the time. So thank you so much for joining us. Everybody's clapping. There's clapping happening all over the country. You just can't hear it, so you have to imagine it. All right. Thank you everybody for joining us. It's always a pleasure. And we are making plans right now for our next curated conversation, which will happen in February. So we'll get it on your calendar. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.